Hello and welcome to this video on GMO safety. Along with a gross misunderstanding of what a GMO is, many activists rant and rave about safety. These are often emotionally fueled arguments, relying on few facts. This can be understood to a degree, as there is much misinformation available on what a GMO is and how safe they are. Up to half the population feels that GMOs are dangerous, and 70% of people actively avoid buying them. And why is this so? First is the timing. GMOs started to enter mainstream consciousness in the 90s, the same time we feared the Y2K bug, and vagrant boy bands roamed the music scene. It was also before the skeptic movements and open discussion of science was common. This made getting reliable information difficult, and it was even harder to correct misinformation once it escaped. It was also the early days of the technology taken for granted now, things like the internet. This led to rumors gaining a life of their own on message boards. Those about GMOs were relegated to the same category as urban myths of Slender Man. This made the initial public perception of GMOs quite negative. It was seen as playing God in conservative circles. Despite this, field trials were eventually underway. As those field trials became successful, the companies who owned the seeds sought approval to sell them. They were the product of years spent in a lab, finding compatible genes, plants, and purposes. Some of the major objectives sought were to reduce herbicide use, create pest-resistant crops, and better yields. Being produced in a lab initially meant that certain companies owned the products, and this ownership became a sticking point of hippies and alternative quacks who felt owning the rights to produce and disseminate seeds was wrong. They held a naturalistic view that if nature made the original stock, then changing it with science was wrong. Even if it was okay to do so, they felt that owning the rights and controlling distribution for a profit was wrong. This created a very dedicated core of activists opposed to the idea of genetic modification. We see them in the current day largely in the activities of Greenpeace. These groups have acted on a level construed by companies and some governments as terrorism, in the way they have handled GMOs and other activities. These groups acted with the underlying assertion that they were protecting the environment through their actions. This came under the criticism that GMOs would affect the environment negatively. This became known as the Green Movement over time. They have also fallen into the fallacy of natural is better. This argument somehow does not extend to cyanide, nor to GMOs. The scientific evidence to support this is often cherry-picked, and in the opinion of most established scientists, either unacceptable or unsubstantiated. The beatdown they have received from the scientific community has been so vicious that they have now moved from claims of danger to health to dangers to the environment, and criticizing the big companies that are associated with most GMOs, particularly the price they charge and the limitations they put on the supply. Some of these criticisms may be well-founded, but the structure in which they are maintained simply diminishes their value. The loud noise from the anti-GMO crowd has led to testing of GMOs. This has also led to some rather notorious case studies, such as the Seralini affair, the short version of which is that the study was designed in such a way that the statistics could be tortured to appear as though they represented a negative outcome for GMOs. In recent years, this has been proven false time and time again. Despite this, the initial work and the fear it instigated has become one of the biggest problems for GMOs. It has led to substantial testing of their safety, tests which are not applicable to any other crop grown. The problem with these is that when you test a GMO, you cannot isolate the modified component. That element is part of the food and is inseparable. Therefore, you test the whole GMO. This means you cannot definitively state that whatever is causing a problem, if it is observed, is because of the modification made. This is also why GMOs are heavily regulated in how they are brought to market and what they are used for. Starlink is a genetically modified corn variety, which was approved in the United States of America in 1998, only as animal feed. This was because there was initial concerns that it may cause issues with the gastric acid in humans and lead to an allergic reaction. This became worse in 2000 when the GMO crop was identified in taco shells and corn dogs. This meant that somebody had been growing the GMO crop, which was intended solely for animal feed, and then distributing it to human food manufacturers. This led to all of the products it was found in being recalled, and the production of Starlink was stopped. This event led to a considerable amount of fear in the public, which is no doubt stoked by fear campaigns. This eventually led us into the early 2000s, where the war on terror raged, and as the war on drugs became the stalemate on drugs. The European Union published its report, A Decade of European Union-Funded GMO Research. This ran from early 2001 to 2010, and it summarized the results of 50 projects, which ran to the tune of 200 million euros. The important element to this was not the cost, but the time and the finding. They found that over that 10-year period, there was no scientific evidence that associated GMOs higher risks to the environment, to the food chain or food safety, to the conventional plants in the area, or to organisms involved in the study. This meant, at least in theory, GMO food was safe for humans. But as with the early 2000 event involving Starlink corn, there was concerns that GMO food could infect or affect humans. This is a perfect example of that misinformation from the early days. Knowledge and understanding of how genomics works wasn't exactly widespread or clear in the 90s and into the early 2000s. It was understood that you could change the genes of certain food, and as a consequence it's understandable that the public might fear their genetic code might be changed by its consumption. The problem is the GI tract will break down most genetic material within a very short time, long before there's an opportunity for it to cross into the bloodstream or get anywhere into the body where it might make a difference. This is true of both genetically modified and conventional crop sources. These two arguments carried on for the better part of a decade, with research into the food safety and the environmental safety of GMOs continuing. That brings us into the last few years, where we've had individual arguments addressed, and we are also starting to get the results of longitudinal studies of a grand scale, particularly those about farming effects. One major study examined over 1 billion acres of farmland around the world, which have been sown with Bt crops. These produce their own pesticide, which reduces the ability of bugs and insects to eat them or otherwise hinder production of things like cotton. As the plant produces its own pesticide, you do not need to spray the fields with anything. This reduces the use of pesticides, particularly those that may go off target. As they are not as specific as some herbicides are, they may have collateral damage for other species that would otherwise not harm your particular crop. What has been found after more than 20 years and 1 billion acres is that there has been no unintended adverse effects to non-target species by Bt crops particularly. Having addressed the issue of environmental safety, we can turn our attention to that of food safety and the controversial studies that have demonstrated a toxic effect, particularly of Roundup Ready crops in humans. As it is very difficult to conduct human trials of things like this, they used an animal model of rats. This is following the same line of reasoning as the Seralini affair, except they used an appropriate model, that is a species that will not produce random background noise or throw false positives, such as the rats in Seralini's study. In this case, a Wistar Hahn rat was matched with others of its kind and fed varying percentages of GMO food for a 2-year period. This ranged from 11 to 50% GMO food. The researchers then took histological sections and other samples and evaluated them for negative outcomes. Compared to the reference group, there was no significant difference over time. This was also true of the dose-response curve, where if you gave the animals more GMO food, they did not have an increased risk of any kind of negative outcome. This is consistent with the scientific consensus of GMOs for the last 30 years now. In summary, there are no observable safety issues with GMOs at present. Some of the ideas that are presented are patently false and fly in the face of basic biology. And whilst continued observation is prudent, smearing GMOs as evil is simply a throwback to older deleterious behaviors in our own species. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.